Even people who are buying under the de minimis arrangements now find it comfortable because they know what the dollar is. You look at what has happened, in fact, in the last few months, Senator Small Sterling and Senator Anderson will tell you, Ferguson. But, yeah, man, I can't call him by his first name here, so that's how I'm used to calling him. But they know that the Jamaican dollar has been such a great thing for investment and for people who want to invest in the country. It's something I sell when I take my trade missions around. I sell that, I sell an independent central bank, I sell an independent judiciary, and I sell a democracy that can allow a prime minister to win 3 times and no question. And when he won the first time, the evening that he won, the next morning he was in Jamaica House, and that's how we do our business in this country. That's a great selling point to people who want to invest in Jamaica. So, Mr. President, through pandemic, through storms, through supply chain disruptions, and ongoing wars, the Jamaican dollar has remained strong, bolstered by our powerful and growing net international reserves. Another clear signal of the disciplined and the positive long-term economic strategy that the Holness administration has crafted and executed with such effectiveness. No question at all that this government has performed, Mr. President. We have resisted the unthinking calls by PNP leaders across the line to use the NIR to spend profligately and even to go out and borrow recklessly. We watch your behavior, not what you say. Recklessly, we will continue to resist those calls, remembering where their profligacy led this country when they were in power. The Independent Bank of Jamaica, Mr. President, and a strong NIR position are really outstanding pillars and position of the Holness administration. Mr. President, earlier this week, Tuesday to be exact, our learned Minister of Finance gave a master class on the principles that underpin the establishment of the Independent Bank of Jamaica and how it works to correct the wayward and apparently really misunderstood leader of the opposition and his spokesman on finance. It was a joy, Mr. President, to listen to the former Minister of Education, now Minister of Finance, the Honorable Favour Williams herself, a graduate of Harvard University with an economics degree and a graduate of Wharton School with an MBA, and she has a CFA. And just in case you don't know what it is, Minister Small Ferguson can tell you how much work you have to do to get a CFA. Tell the truth, Senator. Just tell them for me, because it's a lot of work. It's just a lot of work. So I'm saying when they came up and stand up and say, oh, we can squeeze $70-odd billion to fund the budget, the Honorable Minister of Finance just calmly stood and said, then if you can squeeze that, why would you need to borrow? Why would you need to borrow? And you know it's true. No? You know it's true. You know it's true. Mr. President, when we made the BOJ independent in 2021, we gave them one mandate. That made them responsible to manage and keep inflation within the 4% to 6% policy range. The Federal Reserve in Washington has two. They must look after unemployment and they must look after inflation. The Andrew Holness administration made itself responsible for unemployment. We came to power in early 2016, managing unemployment to a low, manageable level today. Unemployment was 13.3% in January of 2016, Mr. President. Today, Mr. President, the unemployment rate is at the lowest level in the history of independent Jamaica. It is at the astonishingly historically low rate of 3.3%, another marvelously positive economic and social turnaround in the 10-year period of the Holness administration. That brief synopsis I've given you, Mr. President. In 2015, murders in Jamaica, I couldn't sit down without talking about this. amounted to 1,209. Last year, Mr. President, the murder rate fell to 673. That figure is 44.3% lower than the 215 numbers and is 41% lower than the 2024 figure. The reduction in our crime statistics followed those of the significant drop in the murder rate, and they keep falling in 2026, Mr. President. Mr. President, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of National Security, Dr. Horace Chang, the head of the Jamaica Constabulary Force, Dr. Kevin Blake, and Chief of Staff of the Jamaica Defense Force, Admiral Antoinette Wins Gorman, all must take a huge bow for the reduction of crime in Jamaica. However, Mr. President, the biggest kudos for this national crime reduction success must go to Dr. the Most Honorable Andrew Holness, who as Prime Minister and the Chair of the National Security Council is also the Minister of Defense and the Strategic Director and enabler of the security forces to reduce criminal gangs and murders in our country. Mr. President, the Prime Minister, Dr. Andrew Michael Holness, has created and done a marvelous job, because the truth is, I remember so many times in cabinet and in public speeches, he said, we must get hold of those gangs and we're going to give the forces the necessary ammunition to do it. And Mr. President, because we run the economy so well, there was fiscal space that the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance could use to make this a reality. But, Mr. President, all those achievements during the last 10 years of the Andrew Holness administration, those 10 years changed dramatically, because on October 28, 2026, about 39 days after Prime Minister Holness was sworn in for a third term, Jamaica's economic and social trajectory suffered a massive negative weather event called Melissa, a powerful, destructive Category 5 hurricane that damaged at least 7 of our 14 parishes. We now know, Mr. President, that our economy grew by about 4.6% in the quarter ending September 2025. That was dashed by the historically bad damage and that was created by Hurricane Melissa in our western parishes. Mr. President, it is this very damage and very quickly and brutally changed economic environment that the Honourable Favour Williams, our Finance Minister, had to deliver her 2026 budget. For at least 9 budgets, Mr. President, the Finance Minister of the Andrew Holness administration and all of us in government could repeat the positive, true, and reassuring mantra, no new taxes. Destructive, 9, you must count. You must count. Destructive Melissa ensured that for us in Jamaica, there was no new taxes reality this year. We don't control the weather. We have to deal with the weather. And that's how we have had to live with it. Mr. President, Hurricane Melissa broke the mantra, but couldn't at all break the indomitable and most resilient Jamaican spirit. Not even Melissa could have touched it. It was in this changed reality, Mr. President, that Minister Williams presented her revenue measures for fiscal year 2026-27. She exercised the option for the first time to present the revenue measures early along with the estimates of expenditures, indeed a full month before the budget debate. This was the first time that proposed tax measures were presented with the estimates of expenditure. We were confident enough, and she was able enough to make that stick, and there was, Mr. President, on February 12, 2023, Minister Williams, in her elegant element too, calm, transparent manner, no stress, no unnecessary emotion, indeed no distress or tension, but with the gracious passion, disclose the prospective revenue measures. You will recall, Mr. President, that in the years when the PNP, unfortunately, formed the government, there was anxiety every budget date about what would be taxed and by how much. It's good to remind ourselves that burdened us as Jamaicans that with an amount of, they burdened us with an amount of $58 billion in taxes in 4 years. That was the reason for the anxiety and palpable fear when a PNP finance minister stood to disclose a budget. Mr. President, Minister Favour Williams is the personification of calm and professionalism, and she conveyed that calm and professionalism to Jamaicans on formal budget debate day and after debate. Mr. President, Hurricane Melissa dictated that the government has to craft a set of revenue measures after many years of no new taxes. They have been assessed and discussed, those taxes, and the Senate will bear more debate on the unavailable tax measures as we go through today. Today, Mr. President, I will place some focus on the economic growth, productivity, and the government wage bill very quickly. The Prime Minister's establishment of the National Reconstruction and Resilience Authority, NARA, is to ensure that we spend our capital budgets efficiently, effectively, and speedily. Those expenditures will be done through engineering, procurement, and construction EPC contracts by big construction firms with appropriate capacities and capabilities, will enable the funds to be deployed in the marketplace. Professionals and other workers will be employed. Money will circulate in the economy. Many of my colleagues will go in greater detail on NARA. I just want to say, Mr. President, that when this spending gets into the economy, the multiplier effect will make sure that there is a substantial fillip to the economic growth. Once again, Mr. President, I'm encouraging, Mr. President, some people don't listen when you speak, okay? He did single out Senator Smalls, Ferguson, and myself. And I'm watching the clock. I can read clock just like you. There is, Mr. President, a 2.4 billion of the 6.5 billion extended by our foreign partners, the international financial institutions, that must be spent with private sector firms. Mr. President, my encouragement is to these firms is that they must begin to prepare their capacity and capabilities so that they can get as much of this money, because we will be making international offers. The bids will come in internationally. I don't want to see that Jamaican contractors, Jamaica financial institutions, and so on, didn't prepare themselves to get the best as they can get out of 2.4 billion, because, as we said, it's international financial institution funds. We will go international, and we want to get this done well. So please,
everything is within time. The truth lives within you. And if you want to find God, you have to find God within you. And you possess of good and evil, so always remember, don't yield to the evil force. Yield to the good. You know why you yield to the good? Good will always prevail over evil. You manifest the activity.
We must get people ready to take part in this exercise. Both the Minister of Industry, Investment and Commerce, speaking of growth, yesterday we had a very big event to launch what we call the set-aside arrangements for the MSMEs. Mr. President, we have the responsibility at the Ministry of Industry, Investment and Commerce to deal with MSMEs. We have come up, the government in 2019, I think, the regulations were passed, come up with a 20% and a 35% set aside for local MSME contractors. We have been spending quite a lot of time in consultation with the Ministry of Finance Minister Williams has been very, very committed to this. With the Public Procurement Commission, we had a meeting yesterday of hundreds of MSMEs at the Exim Bank, making it clear how we at the Ministry of Industry, Investment and Commerce, for instance, will be hand-holding a great deal of these MSMEs in the road shows, in the kind of road shows we've had for export, whereas the Ministry of Finance and Public Service and the Public Procurement Commission will be making sure that the proposals we send to them and the ones that we put together will become something that will allow them to use this facility much more easily, because while we have let out in the last 3 years about 1.15 billion Jamaican dollars through the MSMEs, there's a lot more space for this to go out. Let me give you an example. Our capital budget for both goods and services is about 187.5 or 6 billion dollars. 40% of that, 20% of that, which is what you're looking at, would be about 36, 37 or so billion Jamaican dollars. So when they're taking only 1.15 billion, you see how much more is there. Now, if we could get them to take 10% of the 20%, you see how much better it would be, or 20%. So we need to get them going up. We're going to spend the time and the money and the learning through the Jamaica Business Development Corporation and other of our agencies to make sure they get the benefit to help us grow the economy. So the set-aside order of 20% and the domestic margin preference order, which is 35%, we're going to make sure those are operationalized. And both Minister Williams and myself are very committed to make it work, because growth is such an important issue. Mr. President, productivity and salaries. Here, the Prime Minister raised the productivity. He has been talking about it. I myself, in my public discussions, have talked about productivity. And the Prime Minister linked productivity with salaries and economic growth. So it was very clear in his mind that you can't keep getting salary increase if you work in a private organization and productivity is not growing, because you're not going to make as much profit to pay it. Well, if that happens in the government sector, what you do is that you will have a costly, no man, it's right. It's right in my speech. You don't understand the brain, AI power, having the brain. Lord, Senator, leave me alone. No? So, Mr. President, when you look at that, if you continue to increase salaries and not getting productivity, you're not going to get profits in the private sector. You're not going to get growth in the government sector. You're going to have a costly and maybe underemployed workforce in either place. So my request, that since this has to start now, we can't wait. Prime Minister has made it clear he's talked to his ministers to make sure that we look at productivity, and our PSs have been given the message, how do we get productivity? But I'm going to request right now, Mr. President, that I suggest to the private sector organizations that this is a matter that affects you incredibly. Whether it's costing government, because government will have to raise taxes to pay them. It's going to come from a lot of it from the business sector. So the business sector, I'm suggesting to them that they could put together a consultancy that looks at the best practices across the world, especially in the Commonwealth probably. How do you get to raise productivity and make sure that your economy grows? And when that is done with the recommendations, that could now become the basis for the government to review and maybe look at how we change policies in a collaborative matter. So we are thinking that productivity and wages and economic growth is not a government problem alone. It is a Jamaican issue, and the private sector in Jamaica I'm inviting to get this going. So, Mr. President, as we look at how we spend the money under the budget. Mr. President, I have 1 minute left. No, I know, but I want to keep my time.
Your time.
You notice that I'm looking at the time. So, Mr. President.
Minister Hill.
This man is my speech. Just
Minister Hill. You can, Minister Hill, you can take it, you can complete your presentation.
Mr. President, I will have a time to do exactly that at the end. But as of now, these are the issues that I want to highlight because my colleagues are going to have a lot to say to you. You're going to see wonderful batting. So you sit over there and cool your heels. Mr. President, I know that the appropriation bills is well planned and well presented. I'm supporting it. I expect that after debate that we will clearly have a smooth passing of these appropriations bills, if it pleases you, Mr. President. I'm glad you know. I'm glad you know that.
Thank you very much, Minister Aubin Hill. Senator Small Ferguson.
Well, you can't talk, man.
Just want to remind Dr. Fenton that the rule hasn't changed. No clapping in the chamber.
Mr. President, I'm honored today to rise to make my contribution to the debate on Jamaica's finances. My bad. Don't seem to be on. All right, great. I'll take it over. Let me start again. Mr. President, I'm honored today to make my contribution to the debate on Jamaica's finances for the 2026-2027 financial year at a time of real consequence for our country and our people. Mr. President, I'm not here to simply play politics or to placate anybody on my side. The discussion today is about the people of Jamaica. At the outset, Mr. President, I wish to express my continued sympathies to the many Jamaicans who continue to suffer in the aftermath of Hurricane Melissa. Those of who have lost their homes, their livelihoods, they still haven't gotten back on their feet. They're still waiting to feel real impact, real relief in their lives. And these are the people, Mr. President, that we have to keep front and center when we talk about the country, the economy, the numbers, the finances. Yet, having had an opportunity to seriously review the budget, they appear, Mr. President, in some respects to be at the periphery of the budget. I'm going to respect the time, despite the leniency allowed to me. I know my colleagues too have a lot to say, and I'm going to focus my contributions on a few areas. As we examine the budget, we must be clear that the fiscal challenges that we now face as a country did not, contrary to what the minister sought to reiterate just now, begin with the hurricane. So my contribution is going to be focused on three areas. I'm going to talk about the underlying fiscal condition of Jamaica prior to Melissa. I'm going to speak a bit about some of the policy choices that have been made in the budget. And I'm going to talk a bit about the implications of those choices for the Jamaican people. The first port of call is to speak a little bit about the context in which the budget is being set and really to dispel the idea that Jamaica was in a state of perfection before the hurricane, which was just reiterated just now. We all know, Mr. President, that Melissa was a significant event, very significant. But it would be incomplete and ultimately misleading, Mr. President, to suggest that the fiscal pressures that we now face began with Hurricane Melissa. The truth is that, Mr. President, despite what the government would like you to believe, in the years leading up to Melissa, Jamaica was already showing signs of underlying fiscal weakness, and I'm going to get into it. These were not always evident in the headline numbers, right? And clear in how the fiscal accounts were structured and some of the policy choices. Right? But there are a number of elements, in some respects, masking the weakness, and I'm going to speak about some of them. First, there has been in recent years, Mr. President, an increased reliance by the government on revenue measures introduced as temporary responses to specific circumstances, but which have been retained and normalized as permanent features of our fiscal framework. I'm going to say it over and over again. Right? The second, Mr. President, and most significant, showing up in our recent fiscal outcomes is the fact that they've been supported by one-off, non-recurring transactions. Right? While these have generated significant inflows, and in and of themselves are not a challenge if done right, they do not represent sustainable sources of revenue. Right? I'm going to ask those on that side to train their ears and listen up. Right? So, the third area masking the weakness, Mr. President, is that targeted measures that had defined policy objectives have over time been redirected from their original purpose. The revenue remains, but the policy rationale has been diluted or in some cases abandoned. Right? And my time is limited. I have a long list, but I'm only going to touch on 4. Taken together, Mr. President, these factors point to a fiscal position that is increasingly dependent on temporary measures, shifting policy around, and non-recurring inflows to maintain balance. In other words, the apparent strength that's boasted about masks emerging structural pressures. This is the context, Mr. President, in which Hurricane Melissa arrived. The hurricane didn't create any of these conditions. It exposed and in some respects intensified them. And if we are to craft any form of credible response, we have to begin with some honesty and acknowledge them and recognize that they exist. Mr. President, I'm going to start with the NHT. Right? And, you know, the time does not permit me, as I said, to be exhaustive, so I'm going to point to the major ones, the ones that are topical and very visible to the Jamaican people. The withdrawal of the funds from the NHT, Mr. President, as we know, was introduced at a time of acute fiscal challenge, right, to deal with a serious issue by the last PNP administration. Right? And it was framed and legislated as a temporary time-bound measure. At that time, there was strong opposition by the now government on the basis that the NHT is a specialist institution and funded by contributions from Jamaican workers, and that the resources should be, quote-unquote, ring-fenced for housing. But since assuming office in 2016, the government has taken a very different position. The withdrawals have been extended through successive legislative changes, and there is apparently another one coming. And $11.4 billion continues to be extracted annually. The government's current position on the NHT has shifted away from it being a golden egg that should be protected towards it now being sufficiently capitalized, right? And that the only constraint surrounding it is housing delivery, right, and supply, not funding. So, in other words, it's in a good state, so the 11.4 billion will do nothing to it. But if after more than a decade of continuous stewardship, right, you just highlighted it, 3 consecutive victories, supply remains a constraint for the NHT, land and infrastructure and execution capacity, as the Prime Minister outlined in his speech. And that is the justification for why the fund is being underutilized. I think that's an admission, Mr. President, that there's something wrong with the underlying framework of the government's approach to delivering housing to the people. I mean, I don't know where you're going to pass the responsibility to after 10 years of being in government. The appropriate response to a supply constraint, Mr. President, is not to divert the resources conveniently, but to improve how the resources are deployed. There are clear avenues to enhance the utility of the NHT to its contributors. And I acknowledge that the government has taken a step in the right direction, improving the benefits to NHT contributors. But more can be done. We can expand the benefits even more. We can increase borrower limits. We can make rates even more concessionary. We can broaden the financing arrangements available for homeowners who are contributors. We can contemplate whether we need to reimagine or expand the mandate of the NHT to extend it to adjacent areas, such as infrastructure, so supporting quality housing. It's not a fund to be raided for convenience, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, the principle here remains clear. The NHT was established for a defined purpose. Redirecting its resources, regardless of the level of surpluses, represents a departure from that purpose. That's clear. And it departs as well from the position that the government previously articulated. So, a housing fund, Mr. President, should not become a fiscal buffer for the government into perpetuity. That's not good policy. Yet, this is what is seemingly occurring. The temporary measure has been embedded as permanent support to hold up the fiscal accounts. And while the effects of this, Mr. President, may not be immediate, over time this approach could risk weakening the institution's ability to fulfill its mandate and imposing a deferred cost on future Jamaicans. I'll say it again, it's not a matter of fiscal convenience, and importantly, the reliance predates Hurricane Melissa. It was already embedded in the fiscal accounts and the framework. So it can be justified to reference the hurricane as being the reason why it's continuing. The second matter, Mr. President, traveling along the same lane, is the asset tax. And, Mr. President, I addressed this matter in detail in a recent debate on the legislation underpinning the measure. So I don't intend to revisit it in full today. But the point remains, the central point remains. The asset tax, like the NHT withdrawals, was introduced as a temporary measure at a particular time in our history. And it has continued unchecked with no specific feedback as to when it will be rolled back. It's now a permanent feature of the tax system. It's been extended, normalized. There is no reference, there is no certainty with respect to when it will be unwound. And it's particularly significant because everybody has accepted that the tax is distortionary. It penalizes capital formation, which, as the minister said, is very important at this time. It discourages retaining financial assets here, which is counter to his own mandate as attracting investments to Jamaica. And it's oftentimes passed on to the customers and investors who ultimately suffer. It's for these reasons, Mr. President, that the measure was originally put forward as a temporary measure, not a permanent one. Instead, it now generates over $10 billion annually for the government and has seemingly become a part of the revenue base that's a permanent fixture. It reinforces the broader concern, Mr. President. And I'll say it again, when temporary measures become permanent and they're retained beyond their lifespan, they're no longer emergency tools. And there's a credibility price that is paid under those circumstances. So in other words, when the fiscal framework is relying on measures that were never designed to be permanent, is the fiscal framework really sustainable to begin with? And again, this one predates Melissa, so I don't want to hear that it's because of Melissa that it's in place. The next example that I'll go to,
yeah, man, big up everybody in the chat here. Right. They have put some things together and go and listen to them now. Big up yourself, Beverly. Big up yourself. Big up everybody over there.
Securitizations of the revenues emanating from the concession agreements.
They are going to take it in,
the Norman Manley International Airport.
Big up on yourself. Go and monitor it for me.
Montego Bay International Airport.
Just go and monitor it. All that to talk to my fans. Just go and monitor it for me here. They take it in and make some things to come on and look more. So I put some things together to come on and look more. So now go and monitor it for me.
When you think about the measures, Mr. President, and the numbers associated with them, it's very difficult to believe that the fiscal framework was in fact on a sustainable path. In financial year 24-25, Mr. President, $75 billion was yielded from the securitization of the NMIA revenue. And in last financial year, well, this financial year, we haven't completed March, $61 billion was yielded from the securitization. Now, let me be clear. There is nothing at all inherently wrong with securitization. Right? When properly structured, Mr. President, it is a legitimate financing tool. Right? So I'm not criticizing the securitizations in enough themselves. So there's no issue in the instrument. But, Mr. President, the structure and the economic substance is what I want to discuss. The transactions, Mr. President, were presented as off-balance sheet financing. It's a way to access liquidity without increasing the sovereign debt, which is fine. But when you think about the nature of the transaction and how it terminates back with Jamaica, we need to examine it. The revenues previously supported the operations of the AAJ. The concession revenues went to them. And now they're being diverted to support the securitization almost exclusively. And the result is now evident, Mr. President. The central government, per the budget, has had to step in this financial year and will be diverting $13 billion. $13 billion to be injected into AAJ to cover the agency's expenses, to include $2 billion for the construction of a new headquarters. At a time, Mr. President, when Jamaicans are being asked to absorb new taxes, the country continues to recover from Hurricane Melissa. It raises questions about priorities, Mr. President. But beyond the priorities, there is a more fundamental issue. If the government receives a large upfront inflow, as was said by the opposition spokesman on finance, effectively a salary advance, and thereafter must make recurring transfers to sustain the entity from whom the revenue was monetized, then what's the true nature of that arrangement? Right? Because it sounds very familiar, Minister Hill. It sounds very familiar. So you receive an upfront lump sum. You receive our money today. and they make payments over time. Mr. President, that sounds to me like the structure of a loan. In that sense, this thing that was presented as non-debt financing to balance the budget, in substance, resembles borrowing. Then what is it? It is, Mr. President.
Ask if you can just, you in particular, Senator Brown, give Senator Small Ferguson an opportunity to complete.
Mr. President, I'll continue. Just to reiterate my point, the matter was presented, Mr. President, as non-debt financing to balance the budget. Yet, it resembles borrowing that ultimately returns to the balance sheet of the government and by extension the Jamaican people. And importantly, this reliance on one-off transactions was evident before Hurricane Melissa. It's not because of Hurricane Melissa. These inflows of 75 billion in one year, 61 billion in another year, supported the appearance of a fiscal balance. But they're not durable or recurring. It reinforces the central point. The fiscal position was clearly in trouble before the hurricane. The final point I'll touch on, Mr. President, in relation to this area of my presentation, is the special consumption tax on fuel and the hedging policy, which I know those on that side don't know much about because there hasn't been any hedging in the last 10 years. The pattern has continued, Mr. President, with this special consumption tax. It was introduced in 2015 to support an insurance program that was supposed to help to protect Jamaica from the vagaries of volatility in global oil prices. I recall. I'm going to get to that, Minister Hill. I'm going to get to that. I'll say it on the mic so the public won't need to struggle to hear. It was tied at that time, Mr. President, to a clear objective. That $7 per litre that the Jamaican people pay at the pump was tied to a clear objective. And it was implemented following wholesome consultation, the same consultation that the minister just suggested with the private sector. And the objective was to reduce our exposure to oil. At that time, it was rational, it was necessary. Oil continues to be one of our major expenses, both directly and indirectly. And our reliance on it represents the most significant, in my view, source of shock for our people. The intent was straightforward, to create a form of financial protection, an insurance mechanism to mitigate the impact of adverse oil price movements on the fiscal accounts and the Jamaican people. The rationale, Mr. President, was widely understood and supported. As the PSOJ said at the time, in 2016, the cost of $20 million, which was the cost at the time to mitigate a potential $200 million risk, like insurance, makes good business sense. So you can support insurance when it comes to disaster preparedness, but you don't support insurance when it comes to our single largest exposure. So let's not pretend like we don't understand the concept of insurance. You pay the insurance for the disaster preparedness, there is no storm, you don't complain. So if you pay the premium and oil prices move in your favor, why are you going to complain? The policy was sound, Mr. President. The only failure of the policy was that it was abandoned. And in more recent years, this government, Mr. President, has justified retaining the tax on the basis of fiscal flexibility, right? And the ability to provide targeted relief. The former Minister of Finance, Dr. Nigel Clark, in the 2022-2023 budget debate, when gas prices and oil prices were moving in a similar direction to which they are today, indicated that the government needed to exercise discretionary interventions rather than a structured hedging framework. And that, Mr. President, is not sufficient. It does not address the central issue. The tax was introduced for a specific purpose, to fund a sustained program to protect Jamaicans from oil price volatility. Instead, the proceeds have been absorbed into general revenues, and the underlying framework has not been maintained. In effect, we've moved from structured protection to reactive intervention. The reality is that the tax is easy to collect and it yields significant revenue. But convenience cannot be the basis of sound policy. The tax was there for a reason. It's easier clearly for the government to retain the tax than maintain the discipline of exercising the structured program to protect us. The consequences, however, is that the Jamaican people are left fully exposed. Mr. President, the opposition has consistently taken a clear position in relation to this. Either you remove the tax, given that it no longer delivers the intended benefit, or you restore the protection that the Jamaican people are still effectively paying for. Mr. President, the protection is necessary. Jamaica remains highly exposed to oil price shocks. We're not an oil-producing country, and our energy system remains heavily fuel-dependent. Limited diversification in the last 10 years. In effect, Mr. President, we continue to collect the premium, but we've discontinued the insurance. And now we're seeing the consequences. Since the start of the year, Mr. President, oil prices across the board are up over 60%. And they're hovering now near to $100 per barrel, well below the $60+ per barrel estimate that I understand is assumed in the budget. This is not a marginal shift, Mr. President. It's a fundamental change in one of the most important cost drivers in our economy. And while the effect on the fiscal accounts may be nuanced, because of course higher oil prices means higher revenue in some areas, but it also means higher costs. What is clear, Mr. President, is that the Jamaican people are feeling it. Right? Gas prices have gone up every week for the last how many weeks? And if things are not resolved in relation to the conflict between the US and Iran, they will continue to go. So it means Jamaican people are paying more at the pump. They're going to be paying more for electricity bills. And, Mr. President, they're going to be paying more taxes. The burden is compounded, Mr. President. It's compounded at a time when Jamaican people are still feeling the effects of Hurricane Melissa. If there was a sustained hedging framework, Mr. President, if that was in place, some of this burden could be mitigated. Instead, the resources have been diverted to other purposes. And once again, Mr. President, this predates Hurricane Melissa. Mr. President, if we step back from the individual examples and consider them in aggregate, a clear picture emerges. If we look at the last 2 financial years, Mr. President, the fiscal position was supported by one-off transactions, temporary measures made permanent, and revenue redirections. And if we look at the aggregate of just the 4 measures that I mentioned, we're looking at between $80 and $100 billion of impact on the fiscal numbers. So I say, Mr. President, even without Hurricane Melissa, I asked the question how we were going to replace the $70 billion yielded from the securitization in 24-25 and the $61 billion yielded in 25-26. The answer must be beyond just economic growth. That's nebulous. How do you replace those big numbers in the budget? Because these inflows, Mr. President, are not repeatable. The Minister of Finance on Tuesday spoke about the impact of non-recurring revenue. And I say, how do we plug this non-recurring revenue? Mr. President, I want to turn to another matter in relation to the budget, which is the proposed reforms to the financial sector framework. Mr. President, let me say from the outset that we welcome these reforms. For several years, stakeholders across the financial services sector, where securities dealers, pension funds, insurance companies, other institutional investors have advocated for modernization of the regulatory framework to better facilitate capital formation and investment. Mr. President, I myself have been at the forefront of that advocacy, having led the Jamaica Securities Dealers Association for the last 3 years. Mr. President, many of the measures now being contemplated are consistent with the positions advanced by the sector during that time. So it's not a new conversation. In my contribution to the debate regarding the suspension of the fiscal rules in December, I noted that Jamaica already has a significant pool of capital at home, yet their ability to support large-scale development remains constrained, limiting how capital can be deployed and trapping resources that could otherwise be mobilized for productive use. And further, I indicated that we cannot expect a modern, resilient economy to emerge if our own rules restrain capital from participating in the very growth we seek to generate. So it's encouraging to see elements of those recommendations now reflected in the government's policy direction. But recognition of the opportunity is only the first step. So the real question, Mr. President, is whether the enabling environment will be created to translate these reforms to meaningful investment and economic growth. Because capital does not simply move because you adjust the limits. Right? Capital moves when there are credible opportunities. Money goes where it is comfortable. When there are good projects, well structured, properly risk managed, and capable of delivering sustainable returns, Mr. President. If the intention is to mobilize domestic capital at scale, then we need to ensure a few things are in place. The projects that are seeking to attract the capital must be commercially viable. The risk management associated with them, the accountability must be clear. The timelines for delivery must be credible. And the execution has to be disciplined, Mr. President. Because the experience of investors has not always reflected those conditions in dealing with the government. Let's face it, we have seen delays, cost overruns, and uncertainty in relation to government-led projects. Right? This is just the truth. Right? And those things oftentimes ultimately discourage participation, Mr. President. This is not the kind of environment where capital flows efficiently. So there is also, Mr. President, beyond the conditions and the environment, the matter of legislative follow-through. Announcements, Mr. President, need to be matched with timely implementation if these reforms are to have any real effect. And that's our job, to ensure that the legislation works. Right? And I know that there are several pieces of legislation that have been sitting on the bench for a while. I hope that the legislation underpinning these reforms do not join them. Mr. President, the opportunity here is significant, but unlocking the potential requires more than policy announcements. That's just the first step. We need more, we need action. Mr. President, I want to close to the final substantive, move to the final substantive section of my presentation. Mr. President, I want to talk about the mischaracterization of the policy framework that was delivered by the Leader of Opposition in his presentation. Mr. President, in her closing, the Minister sought to group all the initiatives that were presented by the Leader of the Opposition together and present them as though they were intended to be implemented and funded in a single financial year. Mr. President, as I am sure the minister knew, and those on that side know as well, that does not reflect the nature of these kind of proposals. They formed a part, Mr. President, of a broader, integrated policy agenda designed to be phased, prioritized, and executed over multiple financial years. This is how public policy works, as you all know. The framework contemplates funding through a combination of mechanisms. Naturally, Mr. President, there would be reallocation of discretionary expenditure in the budget. There would be improved efficiency within the public sector. There would be enhanced revenue through stronger compliance, Mr. President, a topic that seemingly bears no importance in certain circles. And where appropriate, Mr. President, targeted and sustainable external financing over time to compress them together into a single year scenario and then draw conclusions about the impact on debt, Mr. President, is not reasonable, and I'm being kind when I say it's not reasonable. If the same lens were applied, Mr. President, to the government's own agenda, particularly the range of significant projects that were announced by the Prime Minister, then the outcome would be no different if we were to cost those projects, put them together, and launch them in 1 year. We could only fund them through debt, and the debt to GDP would be well beyond the 80+% that the Minister mentioned. So let's not seek to conveniently misconstrue and mischaracterize. The policies put forward by the leader of the opposition were grounded, Mr. President, in the ethos of our party. The opportunity to create a pathway for all through social justice. They were intended, Mr. President, to expand access to housing, economic participation, to upward mobility in a structured and sustainable way over time. Mr. President, this is not a one-year fiscal exercise. It's a deliberate effort to build an economy that works better for the people of Jamaica. And that's the kind of alternative that needs to be presented in a scenario like this by an opposition. It's therefore important that these proposals be taken in that context. Mr. President, in closing this contribution, I have certainly established to the objective viewer a few clear points. The fiscal pressures, Mr. President, that the country is facing existed well before Hurricane Melissa. That's the first thing. Secondly, Mr. President, the burden that is now being placed on the Jamaican people through rising costs and new taxes is occurring in the context of that fiscal position. And there remains, Mr. President, credible alternatives in our view, grounded in better execution, improved compliance, and more effective use of the resources that are already in the system. Mr. President, the Minister has spoken repeatedly about the government choosing a path of fiscal responsibility. Right? And I've heard it repeatedly from the government, choosing a path of fiscal responsibility. But the truth is, Mr. President, for the most part, that choice was not theirs to make. Mr. President, as the former Minister of Finance, Nigel Clark himself said in March 2024, the Financial Administration and Audit Act requires that Jamaica pursue a fiscal balance derived from a formula written into law, consistent with the debt target set in the law. Mr. President, that is the point. Fiscal discipline in Jamaica is not a matter of preference or choice, it's a matter of law. It was embedded, Mr. President, through the fiscal framework strengthening under the administration led by the Most Honorable Portia Simpson Miller. It was embedded, Mr. President, precisely to remove discretion and ensure that discipline would be maintained regardless of the government of the day. Mr. President, this is what underpins the current economic circumstances that the minister boasted about in his presentation. You know what else is entrenched or was entrenched during that period of fiscal reform, Mr. President? I have to put in this plug. It was entrenched in the IMF deal at the time that the Bank of Jamaica would be moved to being independent. So, you know, when you take a look at the current circumstances, even serious elements of fiscal reform were already agreed well before their implementation. The current administration is just taking their time to implement them. So the question now, Mr. President, is therefore not whether to be fiscally responsible. The question is how that responsibility is exercised and whether it's being used to support and protect the Jamaican people who are the ones who have made the sacrifice associated with us achieving this fiscal prudence. If it pleases you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Small Ferguson. Senator Duncan, Senator, come on, engage your other mic for him.
You heard me?
No, Senator Gill, engage that mic for me. Senator Duncan.
Yes. Mr. President. Good to go. Yes. Good, Mr. President, my Senate colleagues, good morning. So, Senator Small Ferguson, you have made a few points, and I'd like to address them in relationship to in your presentation. Let me start with the last one, the point you made about hedging. And the former Minister of Finance, Dr. Nigel Clark, spoke to hedging. He said hedging is expensive, unpredictable, and can lead to losses if poorly timed. And we saw that poor timing in 2015. Now let me explain the approach of the Andrew Holness-led administration to gyrations and movement in commodity prices. We moved to protect the most vulnerable in our country. In 2022, in response to rising energy prices, the Jamaica Labour Party administration launched the We Care Energy Co-Pay program. The GOJ implemented a direct pass-through to the JPS where the government of Jamaica paid 20% of the electricity bill for households consuming 200 kilowatt hours or less per month benefiting over 457,000 people for a period of April to July 2027. We protect the most vulnerable. In relationship to fiscal responsibility and our overall debt management, I will speak to this in the presentation a little more, but I just want to note that the debt to GDP ratio will rise to 68% this year and it will trend down to 60% in 2029-2030. We remain committed to fiscal responsibility and managing our debt dynamics. Thirdly, in relationship to NHD, the NHD will be spending 53.7 capital expenditure this year, which is almost 50% of the total public body spending, not central government, public body spending of over $100 billion. $53.7 billion on housing solutions. This year, starting construction over 10,000 units. And last year that there was significant delivery of units. We can't get into the numbers, but I'm telling you, this 53.7 that's earmarked and in the budget for units. You might have it right here, right here. We will get back to that. We'll get back to that, sir. But thank you. Now, we talk about asset tax. And there was a big hullabaloo last time we spoke about this. We came here to debate the movement in the filing declaration date for corporate income tax. I came here prepared to deal with that, and you accused me of deflecting. When it was you guys, you on that side that deflected, and were speaking about the asset tax as a policy. No, there is alignment across the financial sector, economists, on either side of the aisle of it being a distortionary tax. And the Honorable Nigel Clark and everyone has spoken to that. But we must make tough fiscal choices. And this government of Jamaica, the Andrew Holness-led administration, will make tough fiscal choices. But I note that in the Minister of Finance, in the spokesperson and Minister of Finance, and opposition leader made no recommendation about removing the asset tax in their presentation. Right. So, when we speak about the sale of receivables, the sale of receivables were designed to fund one-off capital expenditures, a one-off securitization measure to fund capital expenditure, one-off capital expenditure, not to fund recurring revenues. Thank you. Okay, that is a strategy to move and get things done. So I will now move into my substantive presentation. Thank you very much, though. Ramon, you make the thing exciting, man. May I tell you the truth, man. Thank you. Let's jump right in. So I rise this afternoon to support and endorse the government's estimates of expenditure for the fiscal year 26-27 and support the passage of the Appropriations Act without amendment. Jamaica's development agenda is squarely on the table. Jamaica's macro-fiscal position has significantly changed in the aftermath of Hurricane Melissa. Prior to its passage, Jamaica managed to record fiscal surpluses in 7 of the 8 prior fiscal years up to the end of the fiscal year 2024-25. While the exception being COVID in 2020-2021. and we were on track to achieve a 60% debt to GDP ratio ahead of the forecasted timeline. Since Melissa, however, the trajectory of public finances has been altered materially. As a result, the government is pursuing an aggressive development and growth agenda over the next 3 years and beyond to return our economy to pre-Melissa GDP levels by financial year 28-29 and to reduce fiscal deficits over this period while looking to sustain growth over the average 1% growth levels we have experienced for far too long. For the months running up, there's a lot of uncertainty around running up to the budget. The country had heard about various announcements around NARA, about reconstruction, but there was no consolidated picture of how the government intended to rebuild, how it would be financed, or what the institutional architecture would look like. So I heard our finance minister courageously deliver the revenue measures for the first time in a budget opening presentation. And I waited with bated breath for a Prime Minister presentation, and he delivered what Jamaica required: an ambitious, coherent, multidimensional plan that brings together infrastructure, institutions, and financing in a single integrated framework. Dealing with NARA, infrastructure, roads, and regional investments, strategies, ecosystems. Central to this vision are 4 guiding principles that will shape how Jamaica rebuilds. Principles that are simple to understand but profound in their implications. Build, number 1, build in the right places. Far too long, critical infrastructure, hospitals, schools, government offices, homes have been concentrated in low-lying coastal zones with full knowledge of the climate risk. That changes now. Where we build matters as much as what we build. Future development must be progressively relocated away from high-risk areas, and that's the intention. We have to build systems, number 2, that can withstand failure. The destruction wrought in places like Black River and Falmouth exposed a dangerous pattern. When everything is concentrated in one corridor, one surge can knock out everything at once. Going forward, our power grids, water systems, roads, and communication networks must be designed with backup capacity and distributed architecture, so that when one part fails, the rest keeps functioning. Resilience and single points of failure are incompatible. Now, let me deal with a significant area that is going to drive sustainable growth for Jamaica. Building regional sub-economies, not just projects. This is an imperative that will drive the sustainable growth. Roads, hospitals, schools, housing, energy, these cannot continue to be planned and delivered in isolation from each other. The vision is integrated regional development, where infrastructure investments are connected and sequenced to create self-containing economic clusters across the island. The goal is not simply to repair what was damaged, but to use reconstruction as a catalyst to build genuine regional sub-economies, each with its own productive identity, employment base, and capacity to generate growth. That's number 2. We're building, number 4, a broader economic base. Physical resilience alone is not enough. A truly resilient nation must also be economically adaptable with a productive base that spans agro-industry, logistics, manufacturing, digital service, and emerging sectors. Food and energy security must be treated as strategic national priorities, not afterthoughts. We will experience shocks, but when they arrive, Jamaica must have the economic depth to absorb it and keep moving. These 4 principles: build in the right places, build systems that can withstand failure, build regional sub-economies, and build a broader economic base, are not abstract ideals. They are already being applied in the rebuilding of Black River and Falmouth, and they will guide every investment decision under NARA going forward. I want to speak a little bit about capital expenditure and the increases. Central government capital expenditure is projected to increase in the medium term in response to the crisis and will average just about $90 billion each year for the next 4 years, central government. For 2026-27, the central government expenditure will be almost $100 billion. No, let me dial back. Central government capital expenditure is predicting to increase in the medium term response to the crisis and will average $90 billion over the next 4 years. For this year, the central government expenditure will be almost $100 billion, which is almost double the amount spent in the previous fiscal year. Public bodies' capital expenditure, including AHD, will also increase by $25 billion this year to $105 billion. So for the upcoming fiscal year, the total capital expenditure budget between central government and public bodies will be over $200 billion and will sustain levels within the range of $160 to $180 billion through financial year 29-30, which is 40% to 50% greater than previous year averages. This is significantly greater. The number is $59 billion This is significantly greater than allocations during previous years, and we will need to overcome capacity and procurement challenges in order to execute on this expanded capital expenditure portfolio of projects. Growth is projected to range from 1 to 3% over the medium term, as outlined in the GOJ fiscal policy paper, so capital spending will be crucial to meet forecasted growth rates at the sustained growth levels above the historical 1 to 2% average. Maintaining these growth levels will ensure increased economic activity, tax revenues, and thereby improving the fiscal situation and moving Jamaica back to a balanced budget and materially lower fiscal deficit over time. So how we deal with the challenges and the delays and the bureaucracy. Timely execution of projects has been our main challenge. NARA and Fast Jamaica are meant to address this. The PM was right to acknowledge candidly that Jamaica has never lacked vision of projects. What has consistently failed us is speed of execution. The root causes are well known: fragmented approvals, cumbersome procurement, bureaucratic layering. NARA directly addressed this for public infrastructure with special powers to accelerate approvals and project delivery. Equally important is Fast Jamaica, which established a structured fast-track pathway for transformational private investments of US $150 million or more. I would like to recommend that Fast Jamaica becomes a companion to NARA to recommend that incorporating both into the same legislative framework or at minimum ensuring statutory linkages between them would maximize the combined impact. The government cannot do this alone, and Fast Jamaica recognizes this reality, and therefore it is public-private sector working together to grow Jamaica. We also have speed. We must overcome bottlenecks at every stage of the construction project cycle to accelerate growth and get us back to normal within this 3-year period. So the streamlining processes for efficiency and economic development will also be critical to the reforms to the public procurement system to make it faster and more efficient, and also to enable the increase in approval thresholds while reducing the time between procurement decisions. So actively being worked on, and will become a reality. Our Minister of Education will deal with the human capital area, but I would say there are significant investments that are being made in the human capital area, because we cannot do this. People are the center of the policy and who will drive economic growth and development. However, to complement the GOJ's human capital development efforts, given the scale of the rebuilding efforts, along with the shortfall of specialized skill sets in the private sector, we should look to leverage foreign talent for higher value-added services, which can transfer knowledge to our local talent over time. This will deal with the structural challenge, having achieved full employment prior to Melissa with an unemployment rate which was at 3.3%, almost full employment. This initiative about bringing in foreign talent with the appropriate skill sets for the private sector and public sector will build capacity while we continue to build our human capital development and equip our labor force. Speaking a little bit about energy, growth will also be massively helped by reducing Jamaica's energy costs, which average between US 35 cents and US 40 cents per kilowatt hour and are significantly higher than our peers across the Caribbean and Latin America, which currently averages 25 cents per kilowatt hour. There should be a sustained focus on bringing down the cost of energy to increase competitiveness and productivity. There will be strategic projects around energy, which will be a part of the portfolio of projects that will be executed. Also, with the negotiations with the Jamaica Public Service, we expect, or others that may come to the table, we expect that this will be an objective to bring down the cost of energy. Public sector compensation and fiscal risk. In the current wage negotiations, all stakeholders will need to take into account the fiscal challenges. Increasing productivity and efficiency of the public and private sector will become crucial to provide increased tax revenues and fiscal space. After tremendous sacrifice and restraint of the public sector, there was a cumulative increase of $300 billion from a compensation level of $222 billion when the public sector held out until the public sector compensation review was completed. And by the time the wage bill was $222 billion. That wage bill has now moved to $519 billion in 26-27. That's an increase of $60 billion per year, or a 20% average in public sector compensation year over year for the last 5 years, from $222 billion to $519 billion. That creates a fiscal risk, and that is a decision that was taken by the Andrew Holness-led administration government about compensating our public sector at fair wages. Now, this does create a real compression on our expenditures. And therefore, we have to keep managing this very carefully, because as a percentage of tax revenues, our public sector compensation is now at 56% in 25-26 of tax revenues and 13.8% of GDP. Now, this is coming from 9.6% of GDP and 36.1% of tax revenues. So as a country, as Jamaicans, we need to work together to ensure that we moderate, manage, and everybody takes a collective responsibility to this, because we need to educate, make our country aware, such that we can all manage expectations. As we know, if you have the public sector taking 56% of tax revenues, and it will average about right around 50% for the next 4 years as outlined in the fiscal policy paper, this will it will reduce the fiscal flexibility we have, and therefore we're talking about health, education, national security, and our social safety net. These are areas where we need to focus, so we just need to ensure that we have the right balance in terms of our expenditures. So we can, thank you very much on that point. You can clap that one in. Keith, can I clap? Okay. You don't want to clap that point? Okay, let's move on. Let's deal with productivity. Let's deal with productivity. Senator Brown, let's deal with productivity. Let's deal with productivity because I know that you would very much want to see the productivity of the public and private sector increase. I know that you would definitely want to see the output of our country increase per worker. I know that all of us want exactly that. So the national effort should be focused on increasing productivity and efficiency in the public and private sector. This will drive growth, thereby increasing growth levels beyond the forecasted 1% to 3%. Thereby, increasing productivity increases domestic demand, GDP, and tax revenues. This will create greater fiscal space, increasing per capita incomes for Jamaican public and private sector workers, greater per capita incomes, which currently stands at US 8,000 GDP per capita, which is amongst the lowest in the region. So we have to increase productivity in order to move this number. And with the development agenda for Jamaica, we have a real opportunity. If we companion increasing productivity with this development agenda, we have a real opportunity as a country to really move these levels of per capita GDP levels, growth in GDP levels for ourselves as a country. So, Jamaica's productivity challenge is a wake-up call that we can no longer ignore. The data the Prime Minister presented on labour productivity was sobering and deserves to be widely discussed. Jamaica produces approximately $8.99 of output, US $9 of output per worker, 8.81. Less than half the Caribbean average of US $20.50. This is a structural challenge, and it demands a structural response, including investment in skills, technology, and the productive sector. The PM has indicated a full policy position on productivity will be brought to Parliament, and that we welcome. That we welcome. Back to the public sector compensation. The PM was right to flag this as a fiscal risk and call for future wage settlements to be anchored in productivity and GDP growth rather than inflation alone. This is a difficult but necessary conversation, and it must be had honestly in Jamaica's best interest. Now, the financing of this development agenda. The core of the US $6.7 billion multilateral package, providing patient, affordable capital for public infrastructure where commercial returns alone cannot justify private investment. That's approximately $4.3 billion. This support package is designed to provide needed capital without destabilizing Jamaica's improved debt profile, and as we discussed a little earlier, Senator Small Ferguson, sir, we see Jamaica's debt to GDP ratio tracking back down to 60% by 29-30, despite increased debt levels to finance this financing of our development, growth and development resurgence agenda. Private sector mobilization, US $2.4 billion of PPPs, public-private partnerships. US $2.4 billion is specially designed to crowd in private capital with the government providing the enabling conditions, and private investors providing execution. $2.4 billion of multilateral funding for PPPs. Private sector coming together with the public sector to execute with timely and at scale. We have seen examples of this. Senator Tomlinson, IDB Invest, and Sagicor, high-value opportunities. IDB Invest and Sagicor with the Rio Cobre water treatment project, which was just implemented about last year, right? That is an example of public-private partnership. We have the model. We have the know-how. Now we scale it. And the capital markets and the private sector, as Minister Hill indicated, must prepare themselves. And we are innovative enough in this financial sector, as Sagicor was in structuring this deal, and Burita has also in other public-private partnerships, that we have the know-how. So let us leverage this opportunity for public-private partnerships. Let's leverage this US $2.4 billion and to be a companion to the $4.3 billion that is funding public infrastructure, $6.7 billion US dollars available to drive growth and development, the resurgence of our Jamaican economy. But we went a little further than that. Senator Small Ferguson, domestic capital. And as president of the JSDA, you have done tremendous work in this regard, sir, in leading that entity. And I acknowledge that.
Senator Duncan, you might have to congratulate him after the sit-in.
What the time done?
You have a minute to wrap up.
Okay, minute to wrap up. I'm almost there. Okay. So domestic capital, mobilizing Jamaica's own savings through pension funds and insurance companies. I was particularly pleased to see that, and you and I are. And the recent reforms announced by the Minister of Finance unlock long-term pools of institutional capital are very helpful in this regard, and this will be an area where the private sector can play a meaningful role in as we go forward. I'll also note that we have a listening government, that the recent government responsiveness on the beverage tax and the environmental protection levy demonstrate that this is a listening administration, willing to make adjustments when concerns are raised, and that is to be commended. In terms of the environment that we have created, and I know that one of my Senate colleague will speak to crime, but enabling to bring down the cost of security as a country, we have done tremendously well with our murder rates trending to things. So, a final call to action. I can beg you 1 minute? No. Okay, let me just finish this one then. I have enjoyed the budget debate. The opposition has put forward solutions and have moved away from their oppose stance, which I welcome. However, Finance Minister, the Honourable Favour Williams from Ty Dixon St. Catherine, has been measured and has delivered a solid budget in her own style, along with solid gut-wrenching blows to the opposition, them sending them back to sharpen their pencils for the next budget debate. I have to acknowledge our visionary Honourable Prime Minister, Dr. Andrew Michael Holness, the builder who has once again stepped up for Jamaica through relief, recovery, and now to our next phase of resurgence. I'm grateful for his steady hand guiding Jamaica through choppy waters, and I'm confident that come what may, under his leadership, Jamaica will continue to move forward to prosperity for all Jamaicans, regardless of class, creed, or political affiliation. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Duncan. Senator Tomlinson, engage. Senator Tomlinson, engage with 2 mics.
Thank you, my colleague. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Tomlinson, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. As I speak today, I do so fully conscious that I represent in part a generation of Jamaicans whose voice is not always reflected in decision-making in this chamber. Young people, and I'm so pleased that the students from Karamak are here with us, and I'm very sure that they can associate themselves with the statements that I will make today in terms of our generation having a voice in decision-making in this chamber. They are the same young people I hear Senator Marlon Morgan, my friend, and the Minister of Education, through the Ministry of Education and Youth, encouraging. I hear you. You have been telling them that their voices matter and that the future of the country is theirs to carry. Yet, when I engage them, Mr. President, I hear something different. And I talk to them, they are my peers, and sometimes I would post clips of me on social media, and the young people would tell me, I'm proud of you, because they see themselves with what is happening here in terms of someone from their generation. But what they say after, Mr. President, is what usually breaks my heart, Minister. They would say, Senator, I don't see a future for me here. They speak openly about their desire to leave and seek opportunities elsewhere. And when I ask them, in the face of tightening immigration policies and the growing uncertainties up north, are you still willing to go? And you know what they said is usually sobering? They say, I'd rather take my chances up there than stay here. That, Mr. President, is very heartbreaking. And what is even more, Mr. President, troubling about that expression is that they are working. They are young people who have a job, people who you would regard to be gainfully employed, Mr. President. And that is the difficult part about that expression. Mr. President, that reality is one of the main reasons I approached this budget debate with such anticipation. Because if Jamaicans no longer believe that there's opportunity at home, then the budget debate must be about creating that belief. Mr. President, that reality is also one of the reasons I've taken seriously the responsibility given to me when the leader of the opposition invited me to serve in the Senate and appointed me as spokesperson, deputy spokesperson for productivity, efficiency, and competitiveness. It is from the standpoint of these core portfolio areas that I intend to make my contribution today. Because if we're serious about improving the lived experience of our people, fixing these structural issues cannot be optional. It is a necessary prerequisite for a better economy. I listened carefully to the government's presentation in the lower house, hoping to hear a clear and compelling vision for the future. A vision that would speak directly to those Jamaicans who are willing to be on the run in another man's country than to stay in the land of their birth. Having listened closely to the Minister of Finance in her presentations, I came to the conclusion, Mr. President, her presentations fell short. They did not set out a clear path to address the structural challenges that have held this country back for decades, which would help to improve the lives of Jamaicans. And with respect to that second observation, Senator Morgan, it turns out I was not alone in that conclusion, because on March 16, I read the Gleaner editorial titled, "Waiting for Transformation." And it made the point, and I quote, "At the bottom line though, Minister Williams' speech was stronger on mobilizing finance than directing finance. Much less was addressed about the underlying engines of sustained development, export diversification, industrial upgrading, lower energy costs, logistics reform, digital capability." Here's the last part of what the Gleaner editorial wrote. "While it recognizes the need for faster growth, it does not provide a compelling map of structural transformation." Not my words, the Gleaner editorial, Mr. President. I then turned my attention to the Prime Minister's contribution, hopeful that he would fill the gap in his bite at the cherry. To be fair, he did make an attempt, and you have to be fair in your analysis. He did make an attempt to address some of the structural issues, but it was clear, Mr. President, the effort did not go far enough. The response, in my estimation, lacked depth in many areas. So when I consider both presentations in totality, I am left with the unavoidable conclusion, even at their best, they on that side lack a clear and credible vision for Jamaica's transformation. So I want to take the opportunity, before I articulate an alternative vision for Jamaica, I want to respond to the Prime Minister. I'll start with the re-announcements of projects, Mr. President. In particular, there was a series of announcements that were put before the country. At first glance, the list is ambitious. It speaks to infrastructure, investment, and transformation. And to be clear, Mr. President, there's nothing wrong with ambition. But ambition must be matched with credibility. Because when one examines these announcements more closely, a number of concerns arise. First, Mr. President, many of these projects are not new. They are re-announcements. Projects, re-announcements on top of re-announcements, Mr. President. Nothing new. In fact, 30 of the projects that were announced, Mr. President, when I checked, were re-announced as far back as 2018. That in itself, Mr. President, raises a question about execution. For example, Mr. President, the Trelawney Multipurpose Stadium development, announced from 2018. In fact, the Prime Minister said it was underway at the time. My God. And the new urban centre for Trelawney have both been referenced in previous announcements. Yet, we are still awaiting clear timelines and evidence of execution. Second, Mr. President, they lack specificity. We have not been given clear timelines. We have not been told that these projects will commence, or when these projects will commence, what phase they are currently in, and when the Jamaican people can reasonably expect to see delivery. And in public policy, my friends on that side know that timelines are a measure of accountability. Third, Mr. President, is very important. When one turns to the estimate of expenditure, and I know this book, I'm an economist, a fiscal economist, I go through this. When I look through this, I cannot find any of the projects announced by the government. And when I look in the public body's estimate, Mr. President, I don't see any of the projects. Mr. President, we in this chamber, Mr. President, the debate exciting. Then get a lick over this, Mr. President. Mr. President, we in this chamber, Mr. President, I want to continue, Mr. President. We in this chamber know that any project that is to be executed by the government, whether directly from central government, you know this, Senator Keith Duncan, whether through the central government or through the public body's estimates, it must be reflected in either one of these books, Mr. President. That's where the resources are allocated. Mr. President, in the absence of them, in the absence of that estimate, then we can reasonably conclude, Mr. President, that they are not intended to be rolled out in the upcoming fiscal year, Mr. President. And we cannot attach any degree of credibility to those announcements. Fourth, Mr. President, is the issue of financing. And this is particularly important because the government itself has been quick to ask the opposition how to finance its proposals. But what is good for the goose must be good for the gander. The Prime Minister referred to the package of financing from international partners. But, Mr. President, that financing is not guaranteed. Senator Small Ferguson did an excellent job at letting us know that that financing is not guaranteed, Mr. President. And where we get it, and you know this, Senator Duncan, where we get it, most of it is debt. If these projects were to be executed or to be financed through that facility in the near term, we would expect to see an indication in the government's medium-term fiscal and debt projections. But when I look at the fiscal and debt projections, Mr. President, it is projecting a decline in the debt-to-GDP ratio, which reasonably tells us, Mr. President, that those projects are not expected to be financed from that international package, which is mostly debt. So, Mr. President, when you take all of this together, the re-announcements, the absence of timelines, the lack of presence in the estimates, and the uncertainty around financing, it becomes difficult to attach a high degree of credibility to these project announcements. And this is not about opposing development. I am for development, but we want clarity, transparency, and alignment between what is announced, what is actually budgeted, and what is delivered to the people of Jamaica. I turn quickly, Mr. President, because I want to finish my rebuttals so I can get to the articulation of that vision for Jamaica. So I want to talk about NARA a bit. Mr. President, to be fair, the government has identified a long-standing constraint within our economy. That's the pace and efficiency with which major projects are executed. That is not a new issue. It is one that has affected the public investment, the private sector expansion, and ultimately the rate at which we can grow the economy. In that context, the proposal to establish the National Reconstruction and Resilience Authority represents an attempt to address this challenge. And I'm fair in my analysis. I'm very fair. So, Mr. President, credit must be given to where credit is due. But, Mr. President, so any serious attempt to improve execution deserves careful consideration. However, when examined through the lenses of efficiency and institutional reform, there are important concerns that must be addressed. First, Mr. President, while we make a diagnosis of the problem, and the Prime Minister did so very accurately, his diagnosis is incomplete. The issue is not simply about processes that are slow and fragmented. It is the underlying systems, the incentives, the institutional capacity within the public sector that are not aligned to support timely and efficient execution. Mr. President, these are systemic issues. Here's the part, and I know you're listening, and I know you're proud of me, Senator, Minister. These are not systemic issues. Creating a new authority does not in itself resolve these systemic issues, Mr. President. And there's an obvious risk that rather than fixing the system, we are creating a parallel one. We're creating a parallel one, Mr. President. NARA is described as not being about bureaucracy. It's described as this is not another bureaucracy. Yet it is being given special powers, a central coordination role, the ability to bypass existing processes. Along this side, Mr. President, or alongside this, Mr. President, the government has proposed FAST. And trust me, there are so many acronyms I can't keep up. You have FAST, you have SPEED. Last year they said they had ASPIRE. It seems as if ASPIRE has now expired, Mr. President, because I can't keep up with the acronyms. It's a government of acronyms, Mr. President. I can't keep up. President, we must consider sustainability. Here's the thing about Naira that I don't think you all know over there. We must consider sustainability. The Prime Minister has indicated that Naira will operate with a sunset clause of 5 years. That makes this question even more important. What happens at the end of that period if the core systems of government remain unreformed? Do we simply return to the same inefficiencies that we're trying to escape today when that sunset clause for Naira comes into effect? Mr. President, a temporary solution cannot substitute for permanent institutional reform. And fourth, Mr. President, there is a critical issue of integrity. Listen, I know you have a significant challenge with this word, integrity, so listen up. Mr. President, there's a critical issue with accountability and integrity in execution. The government has indicated that Naira will have accelerated powers in relation to approvals and procurement, and Fast Jamaica will facilitate large-scale investment through expedited processes, including, in some cases, direct engagement with investors. While the speed is important, it cannot come at the expense of transparency and accountability. To be clear, Mr. President, the announcement of an oversight body and the indication that it will be chaired by a well-known professor is a positive step. He's a distinguished Jamaican with an international reputation for excellence, and his investment should be given confidence. But, Mr. President, strong individuals alone cannot substitute for strong systems. Given the number of issues relating to public procurement and project execution that have been raised by the Auditor General about this particular government, the Jamaican people are entitled to a clear understanding of the guardrails, Mr. President, that will govern this new framework. We simply cannot trust them. We have seen too many issues of misappropriation. So we want clear accountability, Mr. President. What will ensure transparency in the selection of contractors? We don't know. What mechanisms will govern the treatment of unsolicited proposals? We don't know. How will the value for money, or how will value for money be independently assessed in accelerated processes? We don't know, Mr. President. And finally, what real-time reporting will be available to the Parliament and the public? Again, Mr. President, we simply do not know. Mr. President, if we are to move faster, we must also become more transparent, not less. In that regard, there are practical steps that should strengthen confidence in this framework. These should include, in my estimation, mandatory public disclosure of all Naira-approved projects and contracts, independent procurement oversight of key decision points, clear and published evaluation criteria for Fast Jamaica projects, and regular reporting to Parliament and performance timelines and execution. Because, Mr. President, we simply cannot trust those on that side with the government's treasury trust. Mr. President, I want to turn quickly to productivity. It's a core area of my portfolio that the leader asked me to serve as deputy spokesperson. The Prime Minister has rightly identified one of the central challenges facing our economy, and on this point, Mr. President, I agree with him. Productivity must be the core of any serious strategy for growth and improved living standards. But while the issue was correctly identified, I am not convinced that it has been fully grappled with. Because productivity is not simply about output per worker. Again, I'm an economist. I know that. It is about efficiency. We combine all the factors of production: labor, capital, technology, systems to generate value. In other words, Mr. President, we must be focused on total factor productivity. And that requires a much deeper and more coordinated policy response than what we have heard. Mr. President, what is very interesting is that I recalled in 2019, the government announced that it had developed a national productivity policy. Yet, since that announcement, Mr. President, we have heard very little about the status, its implementation or impact. Again, reinforcing my point that this is a government of announcements and re-announcements, Mr. President. If productivity is indeed a priority, then that policy must be brought forward. fast-tracked and tabled in this parliament so that the country can understand the framework being used to drive improvement. Mr. President, the Prime Minister also made a point in relation to wages and productivity, and I hear Senator Duncan taking this on. He indicated that the increases in wages must be linked to productivity and GDP growth, and that increases that are disconnected from productivity gains risk eroding purchasing power through inflation. That's a very valid and important point. But, Mr. President, that principle cannot stand on its own. It must be supported by systems, because if we are to link compensation to productivity, particularly in the public sector, then we must have a credible and transparent performance management framework that allows us to measure output, track efficiency, and reward performance. At present, those systems are not sufficiently developed to support the kind of linkage that is being proposed by the government. So while the principle is sound, Mr. President, the institutional framework required to operationalize it is still lacking. Mr. President, when we speak about productivity, we must also confront the real everyday constraints that limit the efficiency of our workforce. One of the most significant of these constraints is transportation. Trust me, it was difficult for me to come down here this morning when I left Mona. Every day, Jamaicans spend hours in traffic commuting from communities like Papine to New Kingston, from downtown to Half a Tree, from Spanish Town into the corporate area. Journeys, Mr. President, under normal conditions should take a fraction of time, are routinely being doubled and even tripled. That is not just an inconvenience, it is an economic cost. And I know some of you with your blue lights over there, you don't experience this. So because you have your blue lights to transport you don't feel as if you must address the challenge. Because you have your blue lights to transport you, while average Jamaicans sit in traffic for hours, Mr. President. The structure of our transport system reflects a deeper policy gap. We have seen a steady increase in the number of motor vehicles on our roads, with tens of thousands being added each year at a significant cost. At the same time, a substantial share of our fuel imports are consumed by ground transportation. Mr. President, the public transportation system remains inefficient, fragmented, and heavily reliant on private vehicle ownership, often with single occupants. Mr. President, that is not a sustainable model. And it points to the absence of a coherent, integrated public transportation strategy, one that is aligned with how Jamaicans live, where they work, and how communities are structured, and how goods and services move across the country. Instead, Mr. President, what we see is a pattern of reactive measures. Road expansions here and there, adjustments right there, adjustments there, but no comprehensive framework that treats transportation as a central pillar of national development. If we're serious about improving productivity, then transportation cannot be an afterthought. It must be a core component of our economic strategy, because an economy cannot be efficient if its people cannot move efficiently. Now, Mr. President, I want to move to what I think we need to go in terms of a vision for Jamaica. Let's begin, Mr. President, by looking at the government's current strategy. They are wholly focused on macroeconomic stability. And, Mr. President, I appreciate fundamentally that macroeconomic stability is an important facet to an advancement in an economy. It is necessary, but it is not sufficient. In itself, macroeconomic stability cannot propel national development and give the quality of life to Jamaicans, Mr. President. But that is the kind of one-sided, lopsided approach that is being taken by the administration on that side. Mr. President, what we need is a strategy that looks beyond that. Mr. President, what they are doing is not a complete strategy for development. It can bring, to some extent, GDP growth, but it will not result in a significant increase in incomes. It cannot improve the economic complexity of our exports, but it cannot Mr. President, also contribute to an improvement in the real economic innovators. It can insert us in the global value chains, but it cannot and will not allow us to move up the value chain. Mr. President, moving up the value chain is exactly where we need to go as a country. So, Mr. President, that is our central challenge. The goal must be to move up the value chain. It is to diversify our markets so as to reduce our geopolitical risks. And given what is happening with Cuba, I think you kind of know a thing or two about what I'm talking, Mr. President. The only way to increase wages and on a sustainable basis to put our public finances on a truly solid footing, the only way we can do that, Mr. President, to improve health service, to make adequate future provision for national disasters, Mr. President, all of these things, to give Jamaicans an improved quality of life, is to improve that access to global markets and moving up the value chain. So what is to be done? Mr. President, there must be a collaboration between market and state. That is key. We have got to understand that our strategy cannot be reliant on market alone or the state alone. It must be both. And this is a fundamental perspective that I have throughout the entire literature of economic philosophical thinking. When I go through that, my fundamental economic perspective is that the role of the state is central. It cannot be left up to markets. So this sort of neoliberal approach that simply focuses on the private sector, excluding the coordinating and big role of the government, Mr. President, is problematic. One hand cannot clap. We need a state that has a better understanding of the needs of the private sector, because you're just skirting around the edges. You're not understanding the issues carefully. So you are misunderstanding a critical appreciation of the issue with skirting around the edges. Mr. President, on both sides, we agree that more needs to be done. So, Mr. President, what you need is a strong developmental state. The main reason for this, Mr. President, is that development requires, and I know you know this, given your background, development requires patient capital. This is because development takes time, more than 20 years. It's not a matter of election cycle or two which, election cycle or this time constraint between parties, Mr. President. We're talking about deep, lifelong transformation here, not about political slogans. So the need for a strong developmental state is therefore a technical requirement for development. Likewise, the need for strong, globally competitive private sector is also an absolute critical technical requirement. And this is not about ideological differences. Mr. President, if you look across the Asian economies and the development that has been sparked from the 1990s, the early 2000s, Mr. President, the state has been a clear driving force behind that. Those up north tell you that the government should stay out. But when you carefully examine their approach, they have been quietly directing industries and providing stimulus to advance their economies. So while they up north tell you to take a particular approach, if you critically examine what they have been doing, they have not been doing the same, Mr. President. So what we are saying is that there must be a big role for government going forward, Mr. President. And this is not about an overbearing state. I must clarify that. I'm not calling for an overbearing state sector. The goal here is completely different. The goal is to use the state to develop a stronger private sector, Mr. President. In one area is research and development. The extent of research and development that is needed to improve our economic complexity and the quality of our exports to drive us up the value chain cannot be sufficiently done by the private sector. Mr. President, we need the Scientific Research Council and government's allocation in that regard to be directed at looking at the quality of our exports and what needs to be improved. Mr. President, there's a lot more I can say, and I'm waiting patiently for the State of the Nation debate, where we can continue to articulate how we can improve the competitiveness of our economy because we will not improve living standards if we do not improve that competitiveness. I'm not done, a lot more, but I am mindful of the time. So, Mr. President, the fact of the matter is the budget presentation on that side has not convinced a Jamaican who is willing to be on the run in another man's country to stay in the land of their birth. I am very disappointed, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Tomlinson, and we know that you are. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Senator Tomlinson. Would you allow me, please? Thank you very much, Senator Tomlinson. And we notice that you stayed within your allotted time. It is appreciated. Senator Morris Dixon. Minister Morris Dixon.
Yes. Mr. President, colleagues, Jamaicans watching and listening at home and abroad, I am humbled to be on my feet to contribute to my third appropriation debate. And I want, it's three now. I want to acknowledge the Karamak students who are here. I know many of you will leave and go and work into media. We need you more than ever in the media space. We need you to tell the truth, to be able to tell Jamaicans what is real and what is not. And you're going to have to be able to dispel misinformation and disinformation. And there is a lot of that in our country, and so we need you very much. Mr. President, I would like to remind everybody about September 3, 2025. On that day, Jamaica judged the work of the government and its commitments for the future. The people's decision was clear and unambiguous. The Dr. Andrew Holness-led administration was to continue delivering on its agenda. Mr. President, the people of Jamaica gave us the green light again. Green light. The campaign we ran was mature and dignified. We focused on our plans and programs. We took to the streets, town centers, community spaces, and the nooks and crannies of Jamaica, and we brought our results and achievements. We did not cower from scrutiny. On the contrary, we brought our results directly to the people. In the weeks following, we unveiled the most comprehensive, most ambitious manifesto in Jamaica's history. So,
you breathe so hard? How the fuck you breathe so hard?
I recall the naysayers.
Like a coming out. Oh, you breathe so hard? Oh, you breathe so hard? The corruption, you know, the corruption, she come in anger. You hear how she like she upset, the corruption too ripe. So she come talk about the 3rd of September last year. I'm going to tell her this so-called girl. Tell her Batman boss if you go try winning a seat from Paul Buchanan. I'm going to suck your mother. Brawl into pussy.
It would not be able to be implemented. But the electorate knows our character, and they entrusted us with the reins. Less than 60 days from election on October 28, 2025, Jamaica faced down Hurricane Melissa. Through the grace of Almighty God, we were spared the worst. It could have been worse. We were bruised, but God still protected us. With more than approximately 50% of 2024's GDP gone, the scale of the challenge before us escaped living memory. We're in unprecedented water, Mr. President, yet we are rebuilding towards resurgence. Mr. President, this administration is not in the business of making decorative promises. We're in the business of performance. often, Mr. President, in Jamaica's days.
Let me tell you this mad girl, Senator Brown, I wait for you know. Because I know the Senator Brown will come fix the business, you know. So you can go and rant, here.
Gone. Manifestos were treated like campaign poetry, fanciful words to be recited in one season and forgotten in the next. But again, the government led by Dr. Andrew Holness has taken a completely different approach. We made commitments to the Jamaican people. We have sequenced those commitments, and we are now translating those commitments into action. I came here today with our manifesto promises for education, and I can already show how many of the things in here are already being done. Already being done. We said we'd build 6 new STEAM schools, and this budget has provisions for the undertaking of the first 2. Mr. President, we said we would create stronger pathways from learning to earning, and now we're doing exactly that through the Tertiary LEAP program, and I'll speak about that some more. We said we would expand access to skills training, and we're now advancing one of the boldest steps in that direction for Jamaicans. We said we would modernize apprenticeship, and now Apprenticeship 3.0 is taking real shape. Mr. President, we also said that youth advancement cannot be separated from the realities of adult life. It cannot be enough to prepare our youth and then leave them locked out of housing, stability, and independence. Our manifesto promised an increase in allocations for NHT, for example, and an advance, and I know my colleagues will speak about that more. That's in the manifesto. The same is true for essential public sector workers. We said that teachers, nurses, firefighters, and members of the security forces would benefit from NHT mortgage interest reductions, and they're all done and are all in our budget. It's not just talk. So, Mr. President, people are at the center of our administration's agenda. Jamaica's greatest asset has been and will always be our people. And with our people being our greatest asset, education and skills development will sit at the heart of our president. Now, unfortunately, I only have 30 minutes, but I have to respond to Senator Cleveland and your note on young people. I note your point on young people wanting to leave Jamaica. And I'll say to you, that was the experience I had and my colleagues.
Mad girl. The people that ask if I fix this school top in a St. Mary. Eat that mad girl. You go fix the rooftop in a St. Mary. You come back and chat with your so-called mouth. You stink like shit.
At university had. I went to university. I started UWI in September 1998. In the middle of the 18 years of devastation. And listen, especially after your 18 years, I will tell you, my classmates that were in the economics program at UWI and in the other programs at UWI, the majority of my classmates left Jamaica. Why did they leave Jamaica? Because of the policies of the PNP. And I'm talking about back when I was at university. Now let me tell you, when I left this country to go to the United States to study economics and international relations, I had to talk about the Jamaican economy. And I always felt embarrassed about where our economy was, why we weren't speaking in positive terms about our economy. That was 2004. Our country was an example of an economic basket case. Now today, if someone leaves Jamaica and goes to study in any of the universities I would have studied in, they can hold their head high. And why can they hold their head high? Because of the policies of this Andrew Holness-led administration. Our students don't have to hang their heads in shame when they hear about the Jamaican economy. In addition to that, we're talking about youth. I'm just responding, and I wish you were my student back in the day. I wish I had you as a student. Youth unemployment in 2015 was over 30%. The last set of data we had, youth unemployment was at 10.6%. And if we look at the numbers in the United States of America, if we're looking at the numbers in foreign, their youth unemployment rate is at 10.8%. We're at 10.6%. Those are the kinds of numbers we have to talk about. When we talk about including youth, yesterday I was with the Youth Advisory Council. The Youth Advisory Council is with me. They're sitting down giving me policy advice on a regular basis. On Wednesday, I was at the University of Technology. What were we doing there? Talking about how the budget affects young people, and they were able to find for themselves the things in the budget that were really very much wonderful for them. In addition to that, in terms of young people, we see that
you want to kick out a Timberland in your front, just think like
that reservation that's carved out for young people under the NHT, for those who are under 35. That came from the Youth Parliament. It was our administration that listened to these young people and increased that reservation. In addition to that, and I'm sorry I have to use up my time, but I had to say these things, young people asked for help to start more businesses. And we've done that. We have a Tools for Trade program now. Anyone who does a trade program in Hart will get a grant that they can use to purchase their tools. Also, they wanted help to start their business. And we have grants, not loans, grants that we give to anyone, especially if you are a level 4, for example, and you did a STEM-related area at Hart. We give you $300,000, no questions asked, for your equipment so that you can start your life and start a business. And Mr. President, I could go on and on, about young people. But I had to deviate from what I was going to say to note that. I also want to speak just very briefly, Mr. President, on NARA. And I know my colleague, Senator Keith Duncan, would have done some, but I just wanted to note something. The bill is going to come to us in the Senate. The bill is going to have all of the details around NARA. We will be able to debate it at this time. I think it's disingenuous to say that we don't see anything around NARA when we know that there is a bill that is going to be coming. And the other part of it too, in terms of NARA will be time-bound. The Prime Minister has noted that. It will have special powers around it. And this is important. This is very important. I think both our sides agree that it's too hard to do business. It's too hard for investors. We all agree. And so, given the scale of the problem in the West, we have to give this body extraordinary powers so that it can act. But as we do that, it also gives us an opportunity to see where we could actually overhaul the entire system. And that's really a good way to do policy making, where you know you have an issue and you say, all right, I'm going to try to fix this issue and I'm going to change the rules around dealing with this issue. And as I do that, I can get evidence that this actually works, and then I roll it out across the whole system. That's the way you do good policy. And so that's what we will be doing in NARA. But also in terms of young people not feeling the new Jamaica. our Prime Minister laid out something that was beautiful. It was a masterclass in that vision for Jamaica. It's the kind of vision that our young people want to hear. They want to hear about Jamaica and parts of Jamaica looking like Brickell. They don't have to go to North America to feel that they're in a first world country. And our Prime Minister, he went around the entire country. When you really internalize that, and the money is in the budget too for it, for the start of a lot of these, and these aren't going to be done 1 year. These are going to be done over the 5-year period. 5-year period. And so, from Black River, for any young person who may have heard you, I'll respond to those young people. That vision from the Prime Minister, I ask you to play it back. From Black River, you saw a new urban center. You saw the new boardwalk. You saw all of the new areas that are being filled. The Lucy bypass and the new yachting areas that we will have. We will become a boating center. From the Montego Bay vision, how we are going to redo Montego Bay and have it be definitely the capital of tourism in this area. The Falmouth vision is amazing. That is going to be so different than it is today and much more resilient. We spoke about Portland and all the work that's being done in Portland, from Brownbrook to the boating industry. We spoke about St. Thomas and the new port for aggregates at that port in Kingston. And new Kingston Public Hospital is a part of the plans. And we're going to have new JDF facilities in Clarendon. When I worked in government many moons ago, 15 years ago, and I used to write speeches, I used to write about pipelines. And Vernon Field was one that I used to have to write my minister about. And it was always in the pipeline, but we are going to expand that runway at Vernon Field once and for all. So, our plans, so the beauty which we're losing in the debate, the beauty that we're losing, there's a beautifulness to this. There is reconstruction, which is necessary in the West. A lot of our brothers and sisters have been negatively affected, and we have to do the reconstruction work. But at the same time, what's beautiful about the exercise we're taking on is that we've built in this concept of resilience. We recognize that where Jamaica is, we are prone to natural disasters. And so we can't just build back the West, we have to build in resilience in the system. And that's why there are projects all across the country. So, Senator, there's a lot of thought going into NARA. There is a piece of legislation coming. We will debate it at that point. But NARA is absolutely important. In that bill that you will see something that you noted. We've already thought about it in terms of the list of projects that will be articulated, it will be approved, it will be very, very transparent going forward. So, Mr. President, NARA is being paired with an accountability structure meant to give the public and international partners confidence in how Jamaica operates. As you would have heard, we're looking at EPOC, that worked, and we have ETOC in the Ministry of Education, and we'll now have JAMROC, the Jamaica Reconstruction and Resilience Oversight Committee. And that will be an independent oversight mechanism for NARA. So, Mr. President, I want to be on the record of this Senate, noting that Jamaica intends to rebuild with discipline, execute with urgency, and modernize the very architecture of public action. When we succeed, and I know, Mr. President, that we will succeed, NARA will serve as the institutional bridge from resilience to resurgence. Mr. President and young people who may be watching, a new Jamaica will be built before our eyes. Jamaica's best days are indeed ahead. I will, Mr. President, I'll use the 12 minutes I have left to talk about education and the budget. So one of the most important commitments, as I said, that we will move forward this fiscal year is the development of the STEAM schools. Mr. President, ground will be broken this year for 2 of those institutions. Ground broken, meaning contract in place. One will be at Bernard Lodge in St. Catherine, and the other one will be at Minard in St. Anne. I can tell you that Cabinet has approved the procurement, which means it went through the entire process, went to PPC, went to Infrastructure Committee, and went to full Cabinet for one of them, and the other one is on its way to Cabinet. So these are not things in the pipeline. These are actually things that have come out of the pipe. They're out the pipe. And so, Mr. President, the pilot also, this fiscal year's budget is also very important and encouraging for our tertiary students. The student leaders of our two of our premier universities sat right there in the gallery and watched as their work crossed a key threshold. It's a beautiful thing. They said they wanted a program. We met with them. We worked through the details. They wrote me their proposal. I took that proposal to heart. We sat there. They've been in negotiations on the program, and the Prime Minister was able to announce it, and they were sitting up there as the leads on it from UE and UTech. The pilot of the Tertiary Learn, Earn, and Prosper program, which is really the Tertiary LEAP program, will provide a pathway for tertiary education into employment by offering paid on-the-job experience for students. So often they say you can't get the job because you don't have any job experience. So what we'll be doing is while our students are studying, they will get these opportunities in private and public sector to work. And they suggested what they wanted the salary to be, and we worked to see if we could really accommodate it. And we're giving them what the university students asked us in terms of the salaries. So this is a big one, and I salute the UE Guild of Students and the UTech Students Union for their work, and I look forward to working with them to implement the program. And we're starting this summer, not in the future, right here. This summer is when we will start this. In addition to that, Mr. President, the Hart NSTA Trust will establish the Western School of Construction. So we know the West was damaged severely, and there are a lot of reconstruction projects there, and we need to have the workforce. So what we're doing, we have a School of Construction in Portmore, but we need to have one in Montego Bay. So we're going to be opening a School of Construction in the West to increase the talent pool of construction-related trade persons in the West. Another problem we have in my 8 minutes is in relation to contractors. There are hundreds of schools that are being repaired at the same time right now, and we're struggling with contractors. We don't have enough contractors to do the scale of the projects. And so we're implementing a contractor incubator program so that young people from maybe communities or families without means can get the support they need to do it. So we're going to be pairing Hart students and UTech students who are in the area and helping them to be on a growth path from certification to a thriving enterprise. So we're going to be working with them to ensure that we have more of those, and that's absolutely important. And Mr. President, also, I should note that we are eliminating all tuition fees for Hart up to level 5. We've gone to 4. Now we're going to level 5. And Mr. President, level 5 is a bachelor's degree. It's equivalent to a bachelor's degree, so our children can get a bachelor's degree for free. And so those are some very important there are some very important things. Mr. President, I just wanted to talk about the Yellow Book, and I see the Yellow Book there. and it has dog ears all over because we use it.
Yes, yes.
But for those of you, and I know, Senator, yours doesn't have dog ears because you probably use the online version of it. And the online version, if you go to page 489 of the online one, you'll see the numbers for the Ministry of Education. And some of the things you'll see, there are a lot of numbers, but the numbers mean people. So, Mr. President, did you know that only 108 institutions, basic school institutions, do not have a trained teacher paid for by the government? Basic schools are not run by the government, but the government has put a paid teacher in every school except 108. But guess what, Mr. President? Those 108 are in this budget. So every school will have at least one trained teacher at their early childhood level. In addition to that, in the Yellow Book, you will see that we are continuing to provide lunch and breakfast for our worst performing schools. In addition to that, Mr. President, in the Yellow Book, we know there are more special needs students in our country, and we've doubled the number of special needs assistants to 1,400. We have a termite problem in the country, big termite problem, especially in Clarendon and in Manchester. Everybody tells me about the problem. And so we've allocated $100 million to treat our schools. We've also been increasing internet connectivity. We're adding satellite to the mix. We have acquired 800 smart boards, and every single primary school in Jamaica will get their computers for their computer lab. In addition, Mr. President, those numbers in the Yellow Book speak to 18 new schools that will get their security fencing. That's a problem that we've seen, and we've allocated the funds for that. We've also allocated funds for electrical upgrades. And we're also doing significant work on schools like Boundbrook Primary and Donald Quarry High during this year. And there are another 9 schools that have been approved by PSIP, and I can't go through them given time. So, Mr. President, the administration values people development. Despite everything, the hurricane, once-in-a-generation economic fallout, geopolitical upheavals around the globe, this government, this Andrew Holness-led administration increased the allocation to the Ministry of Education. And Mr. President, this was done because we see education and skills training as a pathway from poverty to prosperity. Mr. President, when one stands back and examines our 26-27 Plan of Action for Human Capital Development, a coherent continuum emerges. The task now, however, is execution. We'll now take these announcements, as we always do, from the pages of the Yellow Book to the people. The STEAM schools must be built well and staffed properly. LEAP placements must be meaningful. Apprenticeship pathways must lead to real employment and the emergence of new industries. A resilient and resurgent Jamaica cannot be built by concrete or asphalt or any measure of capital expenditure alone. The new Jamaica will be built by trained minds, skilled hands, empowered teachers, and a confident people. This administration is serious about Jamaica's resurgence. And Mr. President, we are serious about unleashing the potential of people. There is much more to say, and I'll definitely say more because I can't do everything today. But Mr. President, this appropriation bill is the people's bill, and I support this legislation and I look forward to its approval. Please do, Mr. President.
Well done. Thank you very much, Minister. I'd indicated that I would have gone up to 145. But 1 minute, please. Could you allow me, please? Would you allow me, please? Senator Brown, would you allow me? What I'm going, let me take the 3/4 hour break now, and we'll come back at 2:15. It's okay, members? So this Honorable Senate will rise until 2:15 this afternoon. Thank you.
A commercial break.
Yeah. Day to the R and the
Dummy on the beat, so it's a bang.
Oh, them so thief. 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 Tough turn a thief, bombas a thief. Julechi a thief, Roda a thief. Fly Green a thief, Desmond a thief. Babsy a thief, Harrison a thief. Whole ministry in the party a thief. 1 PM make us a blood clot thief. Be a corruption, all police and soldier thief. Jamaica something wrong. Millions and billions, the whole of them a thief. Now them want raise tax, make the highland grieve. When he boil long a poor man get the squeeze. We a man things out and forget his street. 80 million for market me. Yeah, that's a home girl, look how pussy sweet. No bed no in on the hospital. On the concrete, me see the patient. Them asleep. Them a chop right, them a chop left. 1.4 beef for the bus. Shit bag, barrel. Remember you try thief, put barrel. Kill Diana, stuff sharp man in a barrel. Melissa money come Jamaica pussy whole service. So no take and give them. Who no know we nah no us, we nah no. Tough turn a thief, bombas a thief. Julechi a thief, Roda a thief. Fly Green a thief, Desmond a thief. Babsy a thief, Harrison a thief. Whole ministry in the party a thief. 1 PM make us a blood clot thief. Be a corruption, all police and soldier thief. Jamaica something wrong. Joe will solid a mafia gang for this man cause sweet Jamaica land. Killer for youths and not take away land. How come so much court up on the island?
When they just police and soldier man for corruption, you and your big foot.
Big up on yourself here and put some things together. Come back looking at so what if I don't rise up Jamaica from on the sun, everything on the deck. Come back, we just jump back.